Have you ever wondered what happens when a ghost walks right back through the front door? Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the shocking realities of 10 people who vanished without a single trace, only to miraculously, or in some cases tragically, reappear decades later. When someone vanishes, we naturally assume the absolute worst. We search, we grieve, and eventually we try to move on. But what happens when they come back? We're going to examine the actual mechanics of how people disappear and the profound, lasting psychological damage they leave in their wake. Let's dive in. To really understand the mechanics and the psychology behind disappearing, we're going to break these incredible stories down into 4 distinct chapters: stolen without a trace, the voluntary escapists, the unraveling, and finally, the devastating aftermath. Chapter 1. Stolen without a trace. These are the victims of circumstance, folks whose lives and identities were ripped away from them completely without their consent.
It's wild to see the striking contrast in how an identity can actually be stolen. On one side of the coin, you have infants like Zephany Nurse, Melissa Highsmith, Steve Carter, and Savannah Todd. These were tiny babies physically abducted by total strangers or unstable parents. They were stripped of their origins before they could even speak a single word. But then, you look at a case like Canadian Edgar Latulip, and it's completely different. Edgar had his identity stolen not by a person, but by his own mind. In 1986, as a developmentally delayed 21-year-old, he took a bad fall that triggered a super rare case of global amnesia. It completely erased his memory for 30 years.
Now, what I think is the absolute most chilling element of these stolen lives is what we can call the proximity paradox. It's this terrifying reality that these missing people were often hiding in plain sight, literally miles away from the families desperately searching for them. Melissa Highsmith was kidnapped and raised just a 10-minute drive from her grieving mother in Fort Worth, Texas. 10 minutes! Zephany Nurse was snatched from a Cape Town hospital and grew up a mere 3 miles down the road. And Edgar Latulip? He lived out his days as a John Doe for 3 decades, just 75 miles down the highway from where his own missing poster was hung up in Kitchener. Moving on to Chapter 2, the voluntary escapists. These are the masters of disappearance. And honestly, they present a deeply, deeply uncomfortable psychological profile. We're talking about people who methodically chose to abandon their lives. There's a terrifying legal loophole right at the center of these cases. Here in the United States, unless you're committing outright fraud, like trying to collect a life insurance payout on yourself or filing fake taxes, you are completely allowed to just vanish. Think about that. It is not a crime to emotionally abandon your kids or leave your spouse in the dark, utterly convinced that you're dead. The sheer audacity of these escapes is just staggering. Take computer science student Petra Pazitka over in Germany. She meticulously planned her disappearance, going so far as to let a convicted murderer confess to killing her, all while she lived quietly without an ID for 31 years. Or Dr. Carlos Sanchez. Crushed by severe depression, he walked away from a highly prestigious medical career in Spain to live under a plastic tarp in a Tuscan forest for 19 years. Then there's Brenda Haste, who literally left a dinner defrosting on her kitchen counter in Pennsylvania, hitchhiked with some homeless strangers, and stayed in Florida for 11 years. And Richard Hoagland. He completely abandoned his wife and 2 young sons, stole a dead fisherman's identity, and bought an airplane to start a brand new, lavish family life. To really get inside the escapist mindset, just look at the massive contrast between these 2 men. On one hand, you have Richard Hoagland, the fraudster who calmly built a life of total luxury and deceit right on top of his first family's immense suffering. But then you have a guy with an eerily similar name, Robert Hoagland. Robert was an incredibly stressed Connecticut father trying to cope with his son's severe addiction. He vanished, bringing absolutely nothing with him, not even his daily heart medication. He chose to live a quiet, pretty punishing existence as a handyman just 3 hours away. Heartbreakingly, when Robert passed away 9 years later, he was found still wearing his wedding ring, along with a ring given to him by his son. Seeing exactly how long these people were gone naturally leads us to a massive question. Seriously, how on earth do you hide from the modern world for decades? And what finally causes those carefully constructed walls to crumble?
Which brings us to Chapter 3, the unraveling. This is where decades of old-school analog hiding brutally collide with modern technology and just sheer dumb coincidence.
What is so absolutely fascinating here is that law enforcement didn't actually solve these cold cases. Nope. After decades of professional police work, these mysteries were cracked by consumer biotech, random social media selfies, and simple internet search bars. Zephany Nurse's biological sister coincidentally ended up at the exact same high school as her, and a casual teenage selfie exposed their uncanny resemblance. Melissa Highsmith's 51-year disappearance solved because her kids took a $99 23andMe kit. Richard Hoagland was completely undone by a nephew doing some innocent genealogy research online. Edgar Laudelip remembered just 2 words from his past, and his social worker solved his 30-year amnesia case with a 5-second Google search. And Savannah Todd's kidnapper mother accidentally called her Savannah instead of her fake name Samantha in front of relatives, instantly unraveling a 19-year run on the lam.
The timelines we're talking about are just mind-boggling. For Steve Carter, it took a full 34 years to uncover the truth. He was just browsing the internet on a random Tuesday night in 2011, clicked over to missingkids.com, and casually spotted an eerily accurate age-progressed forensic sketch of himself. That single random click revealed that his psychotic mother had given him away in Hawaii when he was just 6 months old.
But how did they slip through the cracks for so long? Well, these bureaucratic blind spots paint a terrifying picture of our past. Folks stayed hidden because the analog systems of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s were so incredibly fragmented, it essentially turned governments into unwitting accomplices. Get this, in Hawaii, police arrested Steve Carter's mother for squatting, while she was literally holding him in her arms, at the exact same time a missing persons report was filed for him across the island. In Canada, government agencies just issued a fresh legal identity to Edgar Laudelip because their databases simply didn't talk to each other. And Richard Hoagland easily grabbed a dead man's birth certificate by exploiting the glaring gap between Ohio's birth records and Florida's death records.
And that leads us to our 4th and undeniably darkest chapter of this explainer, the devastating aftermath. Because as you're about to see, reappearing does not necessarily mean a happy ending.
We've all been heavily conditioned by movies to expect a fairy tale reunion. But the harsh truth is, when a missing person finally resurfaces, it doesn't just magically erase the trauma. In a lot of these cases, finally getting the answer absolutely shatters the lives of the people who spent decades agonizing and waiting for them.
Take Brenda Haste, for example, the mom who left the defrosting dinner to become homeless. When she finally turned herself in after 11 long years, she didn't exactly get a tearful, warm embrace. Her daughter Morgan, who was just 8 years old when Brenda vanished, went on national television and straight up told her mother to rot in hell.
The collateral damage left behind is just scorched earth. You have Alta Apentenko, Melissa Highsmith's mother, who spent 51 years under the agonizing, awful suspicion that she had murdered her own baby. Lee Heist lost jobs and friends because his entire community was convinced he killed his wife Brenda. Robert Hoagland's family was practically tortured for 9 years, imagining he died a horribly violent death at the hands of drug cartels, only to find out he voluntarily lived 3 hours away. And Mary Hickman, Richard Hoagland's second wife, had to realize that her entire 21-year marriage and the father of her child were built completely on a dead man's stolen name. And you know what compounds this massive grief? The absolute failure of the justice system to address the emotional damage? Because of the way laws and statutes are written, the true villains rarely face any proper consequences. The woman who stole Melissa Highsmith and abused her for decades, she faced 0 criminal charges because the kidnapping statute of limitations had simply run out. Petr Pozicka was fined a measly €500 for a 31-year residential registration violation, and Richard Hoagland went to federal prison for the paperwork crime of identity fraud, completely ignoring the 23 years of profound psychological warfare he waged on his abandoned sons. Perhaps absolutely nothing shows the permanence of this psychological damage better than Savannah Todd's story. Back in 1994, Dorothy Lee Barnett kidnapped her 11-month-old baby, Savannah, and spent 19 years on the run across the globe. By the time the FBI finally caught up with her, Savannah had grown up entirely as Samantha. When confronted with the shocking truth, she didn't run into her searching father's arms. Instead, she fiercely and publicly defended the very mother who kidnapped her, begged the judge for leniency, and absolutely refused to use her birth name, Savannah. These incredible, unsettling stories leave us with a deeply uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the system fails so badly, and the deception runs so unbelievably deep, that finally getting an answer doesn't bring justice at all. It just reveals exactly how much was truly lost. So, I'll leave you with this. When a life is built on a lie, what really happens when the truth is finally revealed? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you something to think about.